quand j'ai rencontré la deuxième fois, j'étais déjà à Sobre.
Oui, non, mais
Ça doit être en 49, hein?
Oui, mais j'ai pas de date.
Oui, c'est tout le temps.
J'avais participé à une autre expérience en fait.
Il y a 40 ans, tout ça, on est quand même.
Vous vous rendez compte les enfants?
First question that we have for you is how you first encountered the ideas of Cornelius Castoriadis and Cerisy.
Well, I was in Paris in 1948, and at that time I considered myself a radical, and I was influenced by Trotskyist ideas. And I got to know Georges, who I think you've already interviewed, quite well. And we travelled around quite a bit, and we discussed ideas, and there was no disagreements between us. And then I happened to be back in Paris, I think 2 or 3 years later, and I still subscribed to those ideas at that time, but I discovered that Georges had broken with them, and we had quite heated arguments about a different set of ideas, which was similar in some respects, but radically different in other respects. And he gave me some papers to read, and I was really quite impressed by what I was reading there. And I think then another year or two must have passed, and then I was in Paris again, and we met again, and we started our discussions, and he said, "You must come and meet a chap I know and have a discussion with him. Maybe he'll convince you." And I think we went to a cafe then, and I think I must have spent about 3 hours arguing heatedly with Cornelius Castoriadis, and he gave me such a bashing on every one of my ideas that I remembered it for the rest of my life. He absolutely demolished every one of the basic ideas I had at that stage. I remained influenced by the Trotskist ideas for some time, but very uneasy about them, and every time I came to France I would read later issues of Socialisme Barbarie and became more and more convinced. And that was the original contact.
Okay, and what happened with these ideas that were working on you? What did you do with them?
It's difficult to say what one does with ideas. I broke eventually completely with the Trotskist group I'd been associated with in the 1960s, very early, I think in 1960. And whereas most people who broke with Trotskyism would criticize the organization they'd just left for not being a real Trotskyist organization, because I'd read so much of the writings of Castoriadis and of Sobre, the group of people I was associated with made a completely different critique of the experience we'd just been through. We said that the organization we were breaking with, the problem with it wasn't that it wasn't a Trotskyist organization, the problem with it was that it was a Trotskyist organization. And this led us then to a critique, fundamental critique, first of the whole theory of Trotskyism and Trotskyism in practice. That led us very quickly to a critique of Leninism in practice, and then of the whole Bolshevik conception of revolutionary action, and then gradually to initially a Marxist critique of Marx, and then gradually to a more open critique of Marx and the acceptance of many of the ideas which Cornelius Castoriadis was developing in France at the time.
Can you talk a little bit about solidarity, especially in the 60s when it had an experience in relation to Socialisme Barbarie, and also had an existence that was developing in England?
The group comrades who left the Trotskyist organization grouped themselves in an organization called Solidarity, and Solidarity was also the name of the paper which we started publishing. in a sense, we didn't have to go through many of the rather heated discussions which had taken place in the previous years in France. I mean, we sort of stepped into the scene in 1960, so we didn't have to go through all the disputes they had in the late 40s and 50s. And we based ourselves very much on their ideas. We were an activist group, and I personally think we inherited some of the better features of the organisation we'd broken with. I mean, we wanted very much to put the ideas into practice, not just to discuss ideas. We constantly had arguments with other groups around us. They were all making a general proposition that without a revolutionary theory you couldn't have any revolutionary action, and we were counterposing to that one of Castoriadis' ideas that without the development of revolutionary theory you couldn't have a development of revolutionary action, which is a very different kind of proposition. And Castoriadis came to London on 2 or 3 occasions in the early 60s and held discussions, and we organised some public meetings with him. They were usually quite heated public meetings because they would be attended by all sorts of people hostile to the ideas, people belonging to the traditional organisations. And I remember very clearly one of the leaders of one of these Trotskyist sects denouncing Castoriadis' ideas as anarchism disguised as Marxism. And the other critique which we were making, which constantly got under their skin, is a critique that said basically that all these revolutionary organizations were really reproducing within their own ranks the divisions between leaders and led, order givers and order takers, which were the characteristic divisions in the society around us, and that there was no conceivable way in which organizations structured in that way could produce any different kind of society. If you had a hierarchically organized authoritarian kind of organization, you would produce a hierarchically organized and authoritarian kind of society. It seemed to us self-evident, but clearly wasn't evident to them. And then there was also the continuous critique that we were undertaking of the Russian society.
What sort of activities did Solidarity engage in the 60s? I believe that it was active in the...
Solidarity was quite active in the both in the universities and in the trade union movement. In the trade union movement, it was constantly campaigning for more democracy in the unions, for the election and recall of all trade union officials, making a fundamental critique of how the trade union bureaucracy had arisen. And in the universities, the main critique which we were making was the critique of Bolshevism as being the main obstacle to any kind of emancipation.
You've also done some work of reflection and writing on your own. How have the ideas of Castoriadis influenced you in that work?
Well, I became quite familiar with the ideas of Castoriadis because I translated quite a number of the texts he'd written in Socialisme Barbarie. I was also personally involved in a certain amount of writing, and I felt that familiarity with Castoriadis' ideas helped me understand what was going on to a great extent. I personally was in Paris during the events of May '68, and I wrote an account of what I'd seen and perceived, which was, I think, very much influenced by the concepts which Castoriadis was developing.
What would you say is the main purpose, historically and also today, of Castoriadis' work and the work of Cerisy Colloquium?
I think there is both an importance in what it succeeded in criticizing and in a sense partly in destroying, and in an important significance in what it put in its place. I think that it contributed massively to the undermining and eventual explosion, I think, of Marxism as a dominant tendency in people who wanted to consider themselves radicals or revolutionaries. I personally I've always considered the last few years Marxism as a monstrous mystification. In fact, one of the last manifestations, I know this might sound rather bizarre, it's one of the last manifestations of bourgeois ideology. And what was extremely positive, I felt, in Castoriadis' writing was the fact that he didn't just make a critique, but that he was positing an alternative, which was the concept of autonomy and self-determination and so on. And he was making a critique of modern society, which was showing what the elements were which were preventing people from acquiring autonomy and helping people to develop self-activity and autonomy.
Could you elaborate on what you think about this idea of autonomy? So we're not talking just about Castoriadis, but also about your thoughts on how he has developed this idea.
I don't know how he has developed the idea. I think that's a question you have to direct at him when he first became aware of it. But it seemed to me very, very clear, looking at the experience of history, that whenever there were major events taking place, looking at the history of the last 100 years or so, one saw a pattern emerging whereby masses of people would come onto the historical scene and try and become subjects of history instead of just objects of history, would try and take the fate of society into their own hands, would try and change things. And then each time, organizations would appear on the scene and would tell people, leave it to us, we know best, you've done your job, you've generated the change, go back to where you were, we'll undertake the basic transformation. One sees this repeatedly leading, particularly the example of the Russian Revolution is perhaps the best of all, repeatedly leading to the creation of bureaucracies and new kinds of hierarchical society.
Looking now at this question a little bit more of autonomy, what do you think are the principal obstacles to the realization, or perhaps that's not for you the right word?
I think there are many things that make it difficult for people to act in an autonomous way. Going right back perhaps to the influence of parental upbringing, starting with the family, then through the school, then through experience at work, then through experience in politics. Every time they come up against influences which make it difficult for them to act autonomously and try and constantly force them to behave in a way dictated by the norms of others.
Are there any things that you'd like to add?
I'd like to add that I've always enjoyed hearing Castoriadis speak because of the really encyclopedic nature of his knowledge. And whenever I hear him speak, I always learn a great deal. And I'm now nearly 70. And I still find that coming to these meetings, I learn a great deal.
If I can add one more question, question we've asked before to other people. We're just starting out. We're very young, very fragile. You've had a lot of experience. Do you have any advice?
No, it's not for people of my age to give advice. People have to make their own experiences, learn their own lessons, but that doesn't mean that they have to knock their head against the same brick walls as we knocked our heads against. I think I would encourage them to read something of the experience of others and then make their own experiences.
Thank you.